Hey there, so this is Adam, and let's talk about moving data. Because every single project needs to move data. Being on cloud or maybe on premises, you still need to move data. But in Azure, there's a great service that helps us with that. It's called Data Factory. So today we're gonna get a brief introduction on how Data Factory works and how can you use it in your own projects. So stay and find out how. So let's talk about Data Factory. Data Factory by definition is a service delivered on Azure that allows you to create the data integrations between multiple sources of data. Simply said, it's a service that allows you to move data between one and another service. So that definition is fine, but it's easier to visualize this once we know how the Data Factory works. So let's jump straight to it. So first of all, how does it work? Imagine we have a scenario where we want to move the cabinet from the shop into the home. That's fairly simple to understand. So first of all, what we will need to do, we're gonna get a key and an address. So we need to know where the shop is located and how to enter it to grab the cabinet. Of course, we will need also some sort of information about the cabinet, maybe disassembly info, maybe information about the package, whatever the information is. We then, of course, need some delivery details. So we need to know what are we going to do once we get the package. After this, we're gonna need also an assembly info. So how, once we actually deliver this, how we're gonna assemble this back in to get the same state as we wanted. And lastly, of course, we will need a key and address of the home that we're gonna deliver this to. As you can imagine, this process needs to be overseen, and this is something that delivery man would do. And because a normal company would have multiple delivery men, there's gonna be someone called delivery manager that's gonna be overseeing all the delivery men out there. So that's fairly simple to understand, but how would you compare this to Data Factory? If we would replace this shop with a blob storage and our cabinet with a customer CSV file, this is essentially, we wanted to move this kind of data into some other place. So what we would need to do in Data Factory is get this key and an address. This object in Data Factory is called link service. This is a definition of the connectivity to this blob storage and also authorization like a key. Additionally, we need to create an object that is called dataset. This is definition of this customer CSV file, so a definition of what kind of data we are pulling from the blob storage once we actually successfully authorize there. Next, we're gonna need something called copy activity. So basically any kind of job in Data Factory is an activity. The most popular one is copy activity, which moves one data to another place. And of course, we need to know where do we need to move that data. So in this case, we're gonna move it to SQL Server into customer table. The same as with the blob storage, we're gonna need a link service that will allow us to know how to connect to the SQL Server and where is that SQL Server located. And lastly, we will of course need another dataset, which will tell us, once we get the data from the CSV file, how is the customer table structured, so we can actually input it there. In this example, the delivery man, the one that is handling the entire job, is called integration runtime. So this is the workforce of Data Factory that is actually handling all the jobs. And the delivery manager is actually Data Factory. So it's overseeing all the integration runtimes and all the jobs that are happening. Of course, you can run multiple integration runtime jobs in something called pipeline. So, of course, the pipeline can be one copy activity, although usually it is more than one. Usually copy data multiple times, but when you do that, you just need to remember underneath each of that copy activity, there's gonna be always two data sets. One is a source data set and another is a sync data set. And of course, each of those data sets needs to have access to a link service that will tell us how do we connect to the source of the data or the target where we put the data in. Of course, you don't need to create this many link services, because if you're pulling it from the same source, maybe pulling all the input data from the single source, you can share the link service between them And the same goes for the target. You can also share it. And this is the typical scenario that you use Data Factory for. So let's go and try some demo, shall we? So we're gonna be importing course CSV file from the Blob into Azure SQL. In order to do that, let's go to the portal. This is the Azure portal. In here, we're gonna need three things. First of all, we're gonna need a Data Factory. So let's create it. Click on the new button, type Data Factory. If you get this, click Create. We need to give it a name. I'm gonna call it A4E, Azure for Everyone, ADF Demo. I'm gonna pick a resource group. This is gonna be existing one that I created for this purpose. I'm gonna leave version as version 2 because version 1 is completely different thing, but not the topic for today. We're gonna pick a North Europe, which is the data center closest to me. And for this purpose of this demo, I'm just gonna enable Git, but it's a great feature for you to explore in the future. So I'm gonna hit create. Additionally, since our demo will be moving Blob to SQL data, we'll need that SQL. So let's create that as well. So let's type SQL. Maybe SQL database. So we found that the SQL database, we can hit create and propagate the most common information. So that's gonna be our resource group, the same one. We need to name of the database. A4E database. We need also a server, so let's create new. Seems like this server is free, that's good for us. So let's create an admin user that we're gonna be using to log into that server. It's gonna be A4E admin, and we need to give it a password. Remember that password, but in case you lose it, you can always reset it later on. I'm gonna also pick North Europe because I want my database to be close to my integration runtimes and my Data Factory. And I'm gonna hit this select checkbox because Data Factory is public service, so we need that access to that server itself. So I'm gonna hit OK. I think we have everything. Of course, we can change the compute power because we don't need such a big server. So I'm gonna change it to standard S2. So that's gonna be my standard, actually S1, 20 DTUs, 250 gigs of storage. So I'm gonna review that. Estimated €25. That's what I wanted. I'm gonna hit create. And this is gonna be provisioning for a minute or two. So what we need now is a blob storage as well. So let's create that. So we need a storage account. We need to hit create. And again, I'm gonna create it in the same resource group. I'm gonna give it a name. I'm gonna call it A4E ADF demo. I'm gonna leave North Europe. I'm gonna leave standard, and I think everything will be default. So hit create, let's review, everything is fine, looks good. So my services are deploying right now. I think we already have the Data Factory, which is very good, but let's actually go to storage account once it's provisioned. So storage account is provisioning probably within half a minute to a minute, so we can actually wait for that. So the provisioning just finished. I'm gonna click go to the resource. And on the storage account, I'm gonna be using blob storage. So I want to store my files. In this case, I'm gonna create new container called input. I'm gonna leave it as private because I don't want unauthorized access to my blob storage. I'm gonna go to input container and upload a file. I already prepared a file that is called cars CSV. So I'm gonna open it and hit upload. Upload just went fine, so I can close it, click on the cars demo. I'm gonna click on edit blob so I can show you how does it look inside. See, our SQL server also provisioned. So this is how the file looks inside. This is a classic CSV file. In the first row we have headers, and then we have a data separated by a comma. So since we have our data in the input folder, let's go and prepare our SQL for that data. So I'm gonna open dashboard, I'm gonna go to my resource group. I'm gonna pin it because it's gonna be easier for me to navigate later on, but I'm gonna go to SQL database. In the SQL database, there's this good feature here, query editor, which allows you to query database without need of any external tools. So I'm gonna use it to log into our database. Right now I'm on our database. In order for us to work with this, I need to create an SQL that will create a table where we import our cars. I already prepared this for our purpose previously. So let me actually jump back, copy paste the query. And this query will create a cars table with these columns. So let's run it. Successful. Just to validate, we're gonna open tables here, see demo cars, and expand it. Seems okay. So this means our preparations for the demo are done. We can actually go to Data Factory and start working. This was essential part, so we don't actually have to jump back and forth from the Data Factory, rather than assume those things were there before. So let's go to Data Factory, click on Author and Monitor. This will bring us to Azure Data Factory and of course to our demo. There's a lot of good stuff in here, like create pipeline from template, copy data wizard, and many others. Of course, good videos from the Azure Friday and some tutorials. But I always advise everyone to go directly to Author tab, because in here, this is where you're gonna spend most of your time, so it's better to actually learn it this way. So let's go back to our demo. What we're gonna need to do here, we're gonna need to do this. First of all, we're gonna need a pipeline because everything is contained within a pipeline. So let's create one pipeline. You do it here by clicking on the pipelines and add pipeline. You can change the name so you actually know what it does. So let's call it SQL, or maybe actually Blob to SQL. That should suffice in terms of naming convention. So the second thing we're gonna need to do is integration runtime will actually do it by default when we select the steps. So let's do what we need to do right now, which is start integrating. So first of all, we need to connect to Blob storage. As we already said, in order to connect to Blob storage, we need a link service. So let's create a link service. To create a link service, you go here on the bottom to the connections. There's a tab called Linked Services. You hit New. You find Blob storage on the list. Hit Continue and call it somehow. I'm gonna call it Input Blob. Next, you need to call what kind of integration runtime will run it. So I'm just gonna leave auto resolve integration runtime, which means my integration runtime will be given by Azure, so I don't have to create it on my own. The next is, so we know we will need to connect to that Blob storage, right? And there are several ways to authenticate there, maybe through account key, SAS URI, service principal, manage identity. Of course, the most sophisticated and more secure way is manage identity, but for today we're gonna leave it with account key for the simplicity. Next, Azure Data Factory allows us to pick from our subscription if we have access to the Blob storage. So let's select our subscription, our created storage, A4E ADF demo. Let's test connection to see if it works. Connection successful, which means we are fine. So let's hit finish. And that's done. So the next thing that we need to do, we need to define a data set so that when we pull the data from this Blob storage, we need to know how does this data look like. You go to datasets here, hit on add dataset. We again need to pick what kind of dataset is this. Since we're using Blob storage link service, this also needs to be a Blob storage. what is the format of that file we're going to be picking from the blob storage. And the supported are those 6, but for today we're using CSV. So let's click on it, let's hit next, and let's call it somehow. I'm going to call it cars CSV. Next you need to pick it, so there's going to be cars CSV, but from where? It's going to be coming from our input blob. Now it's asking us, where is that file located? So the easiest way is to click Browse here. Select our container, and within our container, select cars CSV file. As you remember, our first row had a headers, so we need to select that checkbox to ensure this is the true. And next, leave the import schema as default. So let's hit continue. And notice what happened. A new dataset was created, and there are a few tabs that are available for us right now. There's a connection tab, so if you checked something wrong, you can change it here. But there are additional options here. For instance, you have a column delimiter here, so maybe if your CSV is delimited by semicolons, you can change it here, maybe by pipe, tabulator, or anything else. Maybe you have a different system that generated this CSV, so you can change the row delimiter. Or maybe you want to change encoding of that file. You have all those options in here for you to change. But what is good about connection tab, there's a button called preview data here. So if everything was working fine, you can hit this button here, wait just a couple of seconds, and see our data. Since we created a very good CSV, we can see our data here, but because we also selected first row has headers, the headers were mapped to columns, which is very good. And of course, in the schema, you see what was imported. Since this is a CSV file, all the types are string by default. So what we need to do right now, let's go back. We need to actually connect to SQL. And in order to connect to SQL, we need another link service. So let's go to the portal, go back to connections, and create new link service for the SQL. You can either use search bar or go to databases, scroll down, and actually you're not gonna find it here because Azure SQL is under Azure tab, which is somehow confusing, but you can click on Azure SQL database, and again, let's call it output SQL. We're gonna use the same integration runtime because we want to ensure that this is running on the same server. Next, we can connect to this, and we're gonna select connection string, and that connection string will be automatically pulled whenever we select our subscription, server name, and a database. Using this wizard, Azure will automatically grab the connection string to connect to this database, but what we need to do is authentication type also. So again, service principal and manage identity are the most secure ways, but for today we're just gonna use simple username and password. So our username was A4EAdmin, and we need to provide a password. And if this works, this test connection should be fine. In case you have issues here, always remember, check your username, check your password, and check if you selected that firewall settings to allow connectivity from Azure services. If you did, everything should be fine. So right now we have a second link service. So going back to our diagram, we need another dataset. This dataset will say, since we pulled the data and we have it in the memory right now, how do we transform it to put it into SQL? So let's go and create that dataset. Let's hit add dataset. So this time we're gonna select SQL dataset. So we need to give it a name, so that's gonna be our cars table. We need to select a link service that is gonna be used for connectivity. That's gonna be output SQL. And we need to select the table that this will put the data in. So since we previously created, we already have this table available. And import schema I'm just gonna leave as default. So let's go create. So we're almost there. We have 2 data sets, we have 2 link services. So we just need that very last step. That very last step is the activity that will actually perform the copy action. To do that, you go back to pipeline, you go to activities here. As you see, there's a lot of activities, but for today we're gonna be picking the most common one, which is copy data. You drag and drop it on the screen, change the name, so maybe cars CSV to SQL. So we know what this step actually does. As you see, there's a small red marks that something is missing here. So we go to source. We need to select source dataset. So we're gonna select cars CSV. And we need to also select sync dataset. So in this case, it's gonna be cars table. This basically defines this flow that we see here, that we're pulling from this dataset, from this source, into this dataset, into this destination. This is called source and sync datasets. Of course, you can always check mappings if you want, but it's not necessary. You can even hit import schemas to see if the columns are matching correctly. If not, you can always change it here. But our example is very simple, therefore all columns are matching. So if this actually worked, you can use debug or you can publish everything. I advise everyone to always use debug to see if everything is working fine. Because if it does, then you can publish working version instead of publishing something that might not work. So within a couple of seconds, I think between 5, it was actually 5. So it took us 5 seconds to do that, but we cannot trust it. Let's actually validate if this works fine. So without leaving Data Factory, let's go back to our dashboard. Let's go out to our resource group, go to Data Factory, go to SQL database, query editor back in. Let's log in back to the server. Hit OK. And select. Let's select from the cars. So this actually worked. We have everything in our table. We can actually select how many rows did we import by select count. $406. That was easy, wasn't it? We can actually publish this since we know this works. And once you do it, you will be able to trigger this workflow and monitor it. So there are triggers that are able to schedule or call it this pipeline on event. But for today, we're just gonna trigger it manually. So we just test this. There are no parameters for this pipeline, therefore we just click finish. And what this does is submitting a new pipeline run. But this pipeline run is different in a way that this no longer debug. You will actually be able to monitor this here in the monitor tab. So this just worked fine. It took 8 seconds this time. It was successful. So if we go back and query our table, we have twice as many rows. As you can imagine, this is not the perfect scenario because we just doubled the data, which means we have duplicates in our database. So just quickly, if you want to handle this situation, there's always something that you can use here, which is pre-copy script, which you can just type in delete from cars, which will delete all data from the cars table before. This is just a standard upsert. But of course, you need to design the logic that you would want to work with your data. So it's up to you. So going back to our slides, we just did this entire scenario. We were able to pull data from here through the link service dataset, copy this data into SQL Server, and it took us less than 10 minutes. That wasn't hard, was it? So that wasn't that hard, was it? You didn't even have to know what kind of API does the Blob storage have, or what API does the SQL Server have. You just use Data Factory ready out of the box connectors and just integrate everything in just a couple of minutes. So that's it for today. That was the introduction to Data Factory. And if you like the video, hit a thumbs up, maybe leave a comment. And if you want to see more, hit subscribe, and see you next time.